Barley built the pyramids. It paid the first wages in human history. It fed the gladiators of Rome. But 23,000 years ago, it was just a wild grass growing beside a shallow inland sea. On the southwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, at a site called Ohalo II, archaeobotanist Danny Nadel and his team uncovered the remains of a brushwood hut that had been burned and buried under lake sediment for millennia. The hut dated to roughly 23,000 years before the present, at the height of the last ice age, when the lake level was lower and the shoreline was covered with dense stands of wild grasses. Inside the hut, carefully sorted and stored against one wall, the excavators discovered over 90,000 charred seeds of wild barley. The sheer concentration of grain in one location was unlike anything ever found from that period. These were not grains that had blown in by accident or been tracked in on someone's feet. They had been deliberately gathered, winnowed, and laid in a prepared storage area inside the living structure. Near the hearth, the team recovered a large basalt grinding stone, with its upper handstone still resting beside it, coated in microscopic starch residues that chemical analysis identified as barley. Someone had knelt in that hut, rocked the handstone back and forth across the basalt slab, and reduced wild barley grains to flour. The processing was intensive and systematic. This was not a casual snack. This was food preparation that required planning, labor, and a deep knowledge of the plant's seasonal cycles. Wild barley, Hordeum spontaneum, is the undomesticated ancestor of all cultivated barleys that would later feed empires. Its natural range stretched from the Aegean coast of present-day Turkey eastward across the hills of the Levant and the mountains of the Zagros, all the way to the foothills of the Himalayas. The grass grew in dense natural stands in the Fertile Crescent, the arc of hilly land that flanks the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, where winter rains and mild temperatures produced abundant wild cereals. The people at Ohalo II were living in that sweet spot of wild grain abundance, and they had figured out exactly how to exploit it. The radiocarbon dates from the hut placed the barley seeds at 23,000 years old. That meant the inhabitants of Ohalo II were processing wild barley into flour a full 13,000 years before the first domesticated crops appeared anywhere on Earth. 13,000 years. To put that in perspective, the entire span of recorded human history, from the first city-states of Sumer to the present day, covers barely a third of that stretch of time. The gap is so vast that wheat, the crop most people think of as the oldest, would not be domesticated until the Roman Empire had already risen and fallen twice over by that earlier scale. The discovery at Ohalo II rewrote the timeline of human-plant relationships. It showed that intensive cereal processing was not a byproduct of agriculture. It was a practice that predated farming by many thousands of years, practiced by hunter-gatherers who had not yet planted a single seed on purpose. The climate during the last glacial maximum was cooler and drier than today, and large game was less reliable. The wild barley stands that ringed the lake offered a dense, predictable, and storable source of calories. A family group could harvest enough grain in a few weeks of intensive collection to sustain themselves for months. The hut at Ohalo II preserved more than just seeds. The excavators found the woven plant fiber bedding that the inhabitants slept on, the remains of fish bones and animal bones from their meals, and a variety of other edible plant seeds, including wild wheat and wild oats. But wild barley dominated the assemblage. It was the staff of life for a community that had not yet invented the plow, the village, or the granary. They were already reliant on the grain that would one day become the economic backbone of the ancient world. The grinding stone itself told a critical detail. The starch granules trapped in the pitted surface of the basalt were cracked and gelatinized, indicating that the grain had been roasted or possibly soaked before grinding. This parching step made the tough outer husk brittle and eager to separate from the edible kernel. It also partially cooked the starch, making the resulting flour more digestible and extending its shelf life. The knowledge of how to process wild barley properly, when to harvest, how to parch, how to grind, was a cultural tradition passed down across generations. It was not a simple instinct. It was the accumulated wisdom of a people who had lived alongside this plant for thousands of years. The site of Ohalo II, submerged under the rising waters of the Sea of Galilee, soon after it was abandoned, and it sat under meters of water for the next 23 millennia, until a severe drought from 1989 to 1999 drew the lake level down far enough to expose the ancient remains. Danny Nadel directed extensive salvage excavations across the broad, dark soil horizon that was revealed along the shore, working against time before the waters rose again. The burned brushwood huts were sealed by a fine-grained lake sediment that excluded oxygen and preserved organic material in extraordinary condition, a rarity at sites of such great antiquity. The Ohalo II finds forced archaeologists to reconsider what it meant to be a hunter-gatherer in the late Paleolithic. These were not desperate wanderers scraping a living from whatever they could find. They were knowledgeable, organized, and already deeply embedded in a relationship with one specific cereal that would, millennia later, help launch the agricultural revolution. The wild barley they gathered still had a brittle rachis, the stem that holds the individual grains to the seed head, which shatters at maturity and scatters the seeds on the ground. That shattering trait is the single biggest obstacle to harvesting wild cereals efficiently, because the grains fall before they can be collected. The Ohalo II people had clearly learned to harvest at the precise moment when the grains were nearly ripe but still attached, and likely used baskets or beaters to catch the seeds before they hit the ground. That timing was everything, and it required a detailed calendar of observation passed down orally. Exactly 13,000 years later, in the same region, people would solve the shattering problem permanently by selecting for a mutant form of barley that held its grains on the stalk. That single genetic change, as small as it sounds, was the trigger that turned a wild grass into a domesticated crop, and it would transform the human species forever. But that was still more than 100 centuries away from the people sitting in a brushwood hut beside the Sea of Galilee, grinding roasted barley into flour on a stone that left starch grains visible to scientists more than 20 millennia later. The Ohalo II barley was not domesticated. It was wild. Yet its role in the economy of a hunter-gatherer band was already central, already organized, already familiar. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The grain that would become the payroll of the pharaohs, the currency of Sumer, and the daily bread of the Roman legionary had already been feeding human beings for an incomprehensibly long time before anyone thought to plant it in a field. The dependence was there, written in starch and charred seeds, long before the settlements, the temples, and the taxes. The domestication of barley, when it finally did occur, was not a sudden invention. It was the final chapter of a relationship that had been deepening for at least 13,000 years, starting on a lakeshore where a woman or a man knelt in front of a flat stone and turned wild grass into food. The brittle rachis that scattered wild barley seeds across the ground was a survival mechanism for the plant. For a human harvester, it was a disaster. A family could lose half their grain before a single basket was filled. The mutation that solved this problem was stunningly simple. In a tiny fraction of wild barley plants, a single genetic switch kept the rachis intact at maturity. The seeds stayed locked to the stalk instead of shattering. When a harvester swung a sickle through a stand of these mutant plants, the grains came with the straw. They could be carried back to camp in sheaves and threshed later under controlled conditions. The plant sacrificed its own dispersal for the convenience of the species holding the blade. Archaeobotanists working at Jerf El Amar, a small Neolithic village on the left bank of the Euphrates in northern Syria, found the earliest hard evidence of this transformation. The site dated to roughly 9,500 BCE. Among the thousands of charred barley grains recovered from storage pits and hearths, a significant percentage displayed the smooth, unbroken rachis nodes that mark a domesticated plant. The wild-type brittle rachis left a jagged scar where the grain detached. The domesticated rachis left a clean, flat break because the stem had to be cut or pulled apart by human hands. At Tel Caramel, a settlement mound 25 kilometers north of Aleppo and one of the oldest known proto-urban sites in the world, the same pattern emerged. The barley in the deepest Neolithic layers showed a rising frequency of the non-shattering trait over successive generations. The ratio of brittle to tough rachises flipped as farmers unconsciously selected the plants that cooperated with the harvest. Southward, in the Jordan Valley, the sites of Netiv Hagdud and Gilgal told the same story with different details. Netiv Hagdud sat on a low rise overlooking the Wadi Fazail, a cluster of oval mud brick houses dated to around 9000 BCE. The inhabitants still hunted gazelle and gathered wild pistachios, but the barley they stored in their bins was changing. The rachis segments recovered from the floors of their houses were predominantly the domesticated type. At Gilgal, a few kilometers to the south, excavators found similar assemblages in slightly earlier layers. The transition was not happening in one place and then radiating outward as a package that neighboring peoples simply adopted. It was occurring simultaneously at multiple settlements across the Levant and the upper Euphrates, each community making the same quiet selection thousands of times over. By 8500 BCE, the transformation was unmistakably complete at two of the most important sites in the region. Kathleen Kenyon excavated the ancient mound of Jericho in the 1950s, cutting a deep trench through the accumulated debris of millennia. In the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B levels, she recovered domesticated two-row barley alongside emmer wheat. The grains were plump, uniform, and fully dependent on human hands for their reproduction. They could no longer reseed themselves in the wild. The walls of Jericho, among the oldest fortifications on Earth, enclosed a community that had already bound its survival to domesticated cereals. 800 kilometers to the north, at Nevalachori in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains in southeastern Turkey, the same crop was feeding a very different kind of settlement. Nevalachori was a ritual center as much as a village. Its inhabitants carved monumental limestone pillars and set them into the floors of special buildings, foreshadowing the famous T-shaped monoliths of nearby Göbekli Tepe. In the domestic quarters surrounding these cult buildings, excavators recovered domesticated two-row barley from hearths and storage contexts. The grain that fed the builders of some of the earliest known religious architecture was already a fully domesticated crop. Andrew Moore's excavations at Tel Abu Huraira in Syria added a crucial earlier chapter to this story. The site occupied a low promontory overlooking the Euphrates floodplain, and it was inhabited in two distinct phases. The first settlement, dating to around 9500 BCE, was a village of hunter-gatherers who had begun to experiment with planting. Moore and his team recovered seeds of wild einkorn wheat, wild rye, and wild barley from the earliest levels. But in the slightly later layers, the assemblage shifted. The proportion of domesticated barley rose sharply. The size of the grains increased. The weeds that colonize cultivated fields, species like wild legumes and clovers that thrive in disturbed soil, appeared in the seed record for the first time. Tel Abu Huraira was not a fully agricultural village at its founding. It was a community caught in the act of transition, shifting from gathering wild grain to deliberately sowing it, from following the harvest to controlling it. The transition from foraging to farming was not a single event with a single birthplace. It was a multi-regional process unfolding across the arc of the Fertile Crescent, from the Jordan Valley to the Syrian Euphrates to the Taurus foothills. At every site where the evidence survived, barley stood at the very center of the transformation. It was the crop that farmers reached for first. It was the grain they carried when they moved to new ground. It was the food that made permanent villages possible, because it could be stored from one harvest to the next and measured out in daily rations through the lean months. The mutant barley with the tough rachis did not domesticate itself, but it gave human beings a choice they had never had before. They could stop chasing the wild stands across the landscape and start bringing the grain to the ground they controlled. The domesticated barley that had spread across the Fertile Crescent did not stop at the Euphrates. It moved north and west, climbing into the high plateau of central Anatolia. There, on a broad, dry plain east of the modern city of Konya, it fed one of the largest and strangest settlements of the Neolithic world. Çatalhöyük was not a village in any ordinary sense. It was a dense, continuous mass of rectangular mud brick houses, packed together like cells in a honeycomb. There were no streets. There were no alleyways. The inhabitants moved across the rooftops and entered their homes by ladder, through square holes in the ceilings. At its peak, around 7000 BCE, as many as 8,000 people lived in this single settlement. And the thing that kept them all alive was grain, most of it barley. Excavators working under James Mellart in the 1960s, and later under Ian Hodder from the 1990s onward, recovered vast quantities of carbonized plant remains from the floors of Çatalhöyük's houses. The dominant cereal, found in nearly every domestic context, was hulled two-row barley. The grains were small by modern standards, but they were unmistakably domesticated. They had the same smooth rachis nodes and plump kernels that had appeared centuries earlier at Jericho and Nevalachori. The inhabitants stored their barley in large rectangular bins, built directly into the plastered floors of their houses. Each bin was lined with fine clay and sealed with a removable lid. A household might keep several bins, some for immediate use, others for the lean months ahead. Alongside the bins, excavators found the tools of daily grain processing. Heavy basalt querns, worn smooth from years of grinding, sat on platforms near the hearths. Shallow limestone mortars held the crushed remains of the last meals prepared in them. Handstones shaped by thousands of repetitive strokes still carried the faint polish of barley starch embedded in their pores. The physical effort required to process barley into edible food was staggering. Every grain of barley has a tough, inedible husk that adheres tightly to the kernel. Before it could be eaten, it had to be parched over a fire to loosen the husk, then pounded in a mortar, then ground on a quern. The work fell predominantly to women, and the repetitive stress of grinding grain left unmistakable marks on their skeletons. Bioarchaeological studies of the human remains from Çatalhöyük found severe osteoarthritis in the lower back, knees, and wrists of many adult females. The grinding of barley shaped their bones as surely as the domestication of barley shaped their society. What did they make with all that ground grain? The evidence points to three main foods: porridge, flatbread, and almost certainly beer. Porridge was the simplest preparation. Crushed barley boiled with water into a thick gray paste that could be eaten hot. Traces of charred porridge residue survived on the inner surfaces of cooking pots recovered from the houses. Flatbread required more effort, mixing barley flour with water into a stiff dough, then baking the rounds on hot stones or against the inner walls of domed oven. The ovens at Çatalhöyük were built into the southern walls of the main rooms, domed structures of clay and plaster, with a flat cooking surface at the base. Charred bread fragments, dense and gritty with barley bran, turned up in the sweepings on house floors. But the most intriguing possibility was beer. Barley contains natural enzymes that convert its starches into fermentable sugars. Add water, let it sit, and wild yeasts will begin the work of turning grain into alcohol. In 2004, a team led by chemist Patrick McGovern analyzed residues from large pottery vats found in a building at Çatalhöyük. The vats contained traces of calcium oxalate, the same compound that precipitates out of barley beer during brewing and storage. The inhabitants of Çatalhöyük were not just baking bread and boiling porridge. They were fermenting grain into a mildly alcoholic drink that likely served both social and ritual purposes. The barley that fed this enormous settlement did not grow itself on the Anatolian plateau. It survived there because the plant possessed a set of traits that made it uniquely suited to the environment. Central Anatolia is semi-arid country. The summers are hot and bone-dry, the winters cold, and the rainfall erratic, rarely exceeding 350 millimeters a year. Most wild grasses struggle in those conditions. Barley thrived. It matured faster than wheat, going from seed to harvest in as little as 90 days. It sends its roots deeper into the soil, pulling moisture from layers that other cereals cannot reach. It tolerates poor, thin soils and survives late frosts that would kill more delicate crops. These hard-won adaptations, shaped during its wild past on the dry slopes of the Fertile Crescent, made barley the perfect crop for the Anatolian frontier. The farmers of Çatalhöyük knew this. They planted barley year after year in the fields that radiated out from the settlement, rotating their plots as the soil tired. The grain they harvested came back to the houses, filled the bins, fed the grindstones, fueled the ovens, and ultimately built the bodies of the thousands of people who called Çatalhöyük home. And when those people died, barley went with them into the grave. Excavators found the skeletons of the dead buried beneath the floors of the houses, curled into fetal positions, often accompanied by offerings of food. Among the grave goods were clay bowls containing barley grains, placed beside the dead for a journey into whatever came next. The grain that sustained them in life accompanied them in death. Çatalhöyük thrived for nearly 2,000 years, from roughly 7,500 to 5,700 BCE. But its influence on the wider world of farming was only beginning to register. By the time the settlement finally emptied, the package of domesticated barley, wheat, and pulses that had sustained it was already moving along the routes that would carry it far beyond Anatolia. The grain was heading east. The grain moved east along routes older than memory. It crossed the high passes of the Hindu Kush, carried in leather sacks on the backs of traders and herders. It descended into the river valleys of what is now Balochistan, in present-day Pakistan. And there, around 7000 BCE, it took root in a place called Mergar. Mergar sat at the foot of the Bolan Pass, a natural corridor connecting the Iranian plateau to the Indus plain. The site occupied about 200 hectares of alluvial fan, watered by the seasonal Bolan River. When the French archaeologist Jean-François Jarige began systematic excavations there in 1974, he uncovered something no one had expected. Beneath a massive mound of later occupation debris lay a deeply stratified Neolithic settlement. The lowest layers contained mud brick houses, stone tools, and the charred remains of domesticated barley. This was the earliest known farming community in the Indus Valley, predating the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro by more than 4,000 years. The barley at Mehrgar was not the two-row variety that had fed Çatalhöyük in Jericho. It was six-row barley, a form with three fertile spikelets at each node of the rachis, instead of the single fertile spikelet of the two-row type. Six-row barley packed more grain onto each head, making it more productive per plant under certain conditions. Gerridge's team recovered thousands of carbonized six-row barley grains from the earliest occupation levels. The grains were plump, uniform, and clearly domesticated. Their rachis nodes were smooth and unbroken, showing the tough attachment that kept the grain on the stalk until harvest. Alongside the barley, the inhabitants grew emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and lentils. They herded domestic goats, sheep, and cattle, the bones of which filled the trash pits between the houses. But barley was the dominant cereal, the caloric backbone of the settlement. The people of Mehrgar stored their barley in mud brick granaries of a sophistication not seen in earlier settlements further west. These granaries were rectangular structures with thick walls and raised floors, designed to keep the grain dry and safe from rodents. Each granary held enough barley to feed several families for months beyond the harvest season. That surplus was the central innovation. A community that stored grain could survive drought years, feed specialists who did not farm, and trade with neighboring groups for goods they lacked. Excavators found evidence of long-distance trade at Mehrgar, even in the earliest levels. Lapis lazuli from Badakhshan in Afghanistan, turquoise from Iran, marine shells from the Arabian seacoast. Barley was the engine that made that exchange possible. The very grain that fed the settlement also freed some of its members from the fields to weave cotton, shape pottery, and work copper. Mehrgar became, over centuries, a center of technological innovation. Its potters produced wheel-thrown ceramics painted with elaborate geometric designs. Its metalworkers smelted copper in small furnaces, one of the earliest examples of metallurgy in South Asia. Its dentists used tiny flint drills to treat tooth decay, leaving marks on molars that have survived for 9,000 years. None of that specialization would have been possible without the reliable surplus that barley provided. The domestication of six-row barley at Mehrgar represented something distinct from the earlier domestication of two-row barley in the Levant. Genetic evidence suggests that six-row barley arose independently through a mutation that made all three spikelets at each rachis node fertile, rather than just the central one. This mutation likely occurred in the wild barley populations of the Iranian Plateau or the mountains of Central Asia. The farmers of Mehrgar either selected it themselves or received it from communities further north and east. Either way, the six-row barley of Mehrgar marked a second center of domestication, a parallel agricultural revolution unfolding on the eastern edge of the Iranian plateau. The implications were enormous. Barley was now advancing along two fronts, the two-row variety pushing west into Europe and North Africa, the six-row variety pushing east into South Asia. A single plant species was adapting to the needs of farmers across half the known world. At Mehrgar, that adaptation translated into sheer numbers. The site grew from a small village of perhaps a few hundred people around 7,000 BCE into a substantial town of several thousand by 5,000 BCE. Its dead were buried in clay-lined graves with offerings of barley grain, stone tools, and personal ornaments. The skeletons showed the same patterns of wear that marked the people of Çatalhöyük: arthritic spines from grinding grain, worn teeth from grit-laden bread, robust upper arms from pounding and lifting. Barley shaped the bodies of the living and followed the dead into the earth. By 5,500 BCE, the farming package that had proved so successful at Mehrgar began to spread down the Indus River and its tributaries. Settlements appeared at Amri, Kot Diji, and eventually at the sites that would grow into the great cities of the Indus civilization. Everywhere the pattern repeated: barley in the fields, barley in the granaries, barley in the cooking pots. The foundation of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated urban cultures was laid not by conquest or invention, but by a quiet grain that had traveled from the Anatolian plateau to the foothills of Baluchistan. It had crossed mountains and deserts, survived in saddlebags and clay pots, and found a new home in the dry alluvial soils of the Indus Valley. Once there, it did exactly what it had done at Çatalhöyük, at Jericho, and at the vanished settlements along the Euphrates. It fed the people who built the city walls, dug the irrigation canals, and raised the granaries that would, in time, hold the wealth of an empire. By 3500 BCE, the southern Mesopotamian plain was a network of mud brick cities rising above the floodplain. The largest of these was Uruk, sprawling across more than 2 square miles along the old course of the Euphrates. Its population likely exceeded 40,000 people, the largest urban concentration the world had yet seen. The city was dominated by 2 great temple complexes, the Eanna district dedicated to the goddess Inanna and the Anu district dedicated to the sky god An. Within the Eanna complex, a new technology was emerging that would change the relationship between Barley and human society forever. Scribes began pressing the sharpened tip of a reed stylus into small tablets of damp clay, leaving wedge-shaped marks that hardened into permanent records. The script was proto-cuneiform, the earliest known writing system on Earth. The first tablets to emerge from the Eanna district were not poems or prayers. They were administrative records. The vast majority of the roughly 5,000 proto-cuneiform tablets recovered from Uruk document a single subject: the movement and distribution of grain. And the grain they recorded most frequently was barley. A typical tablet from the Eanna complex listed the number of barley rations distributed to a specific group of workers. The scribe would press a pictograph into the clay, a stylized ear of barley, followed by numerical impressions using a variety of counting systems. The pictograph for barley was a simple, elegant mark, a single line with a diagonal cross-stroke through its center, representing a stalk of grain stripped of its head. It appeared again and again across the tablets, the most common sign in the earliest surviving corpus of human writing. The numerical notations beside it were equally sophisticated, using a sexagesimal system based on multiples of 60 that Mesopotamian civilization bequeathed to the modern world in the form of 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. The scribes recorded barley in precise quantities, small amounts for individual workers, larger amounts for temple officials, and enormous totals for the central storehouses. Around 3200 BCE, the scribes of Uruk produced a document that archaeologists now call the Standard Professions List. It was a compilation of official titles and occupations, arranged in hierarchical order, from the highest priestly offices to the humblest manual laborers. Beside each entry, the scribe placed the barley pictograph and a numeral indicating the quantity of grain allocated as compensation for that position. This decision seems small at the time. It was not. The Standard Professions List transformed barley from a foodstuff into a formal unit of account. A person's place in the social order could now be expressed in grain. The temple bureaucracies that controlled the Eanna complex managed barley as a state resource of immense scope. Clay ceilings stamped with cylinder seals were affixed to jars of grain, to baskets of harvested heads, to the clay plugs that sealed storage room doors. Each ceiling bore the mark of the official responsible, creating a chain of accountability that stretched from the field to the temple storehouse. The seal impressions acted as a kind of signature, a guarantee that the grain had been verified, measured, and recorded by an authorized agent of the temple. The temple was not merely a religious institution, it was the central economic engine of the city. It owned vast tracts of agricultural land worked by dependent laborers who received barley rations in return for their service. It coordinated irrigation maintenance, organized planting and harvest schedules, and collected the surplus that sustained the city's priestly and scribal elite. And it used writing to track every single transaction. Barley was the thread that ran through all of it. Wages were paid in barley, tax obligations were calculated in barley, debts between individuals were denominated in barley. The physical grain itself began to function as a medium of exchange, a proto-currency that could be handed from one person to another in payment for goods or services. A laborer who received more barley than his family could eat might trade the surplus for pottery, textiles, or tools. A merchant traveling between cities might carry barley as portable wealth, convertible into any local commodity. The Sumerian word for barley, she, became so deeply embedded in the language of value that it was used as a determinative sign for all units of measurement and all forms of payment. Even when silver and other metals later emerged as higher value media of exchange, the accounting systems that tracked them were built on the same sexagesimal framework first developed for barley. The granaries of the Eanna complex were monumental structures, their thick walls rising above the surrounding courtyards. Inside, barley was stored in enormous quantities, thousands upon thousands of liters. The temple scribes maintained running inventories, recording each deposit from the harvest wagons and each withdrawal for rations, offerings, and seed grain. They tracked the age of stored grain, knowing that older stocks had to be used before newer ones. They recorded losses to spoilage, theft, and the rats that infested every ancient granary. They calculated forward, estimating how much seed would be needed for the next planting and how much would remain for consumption. The entire food supply of the city passed through their clay tablets. This was the birth of the command economy, and it was built on barley. A single crop had forced humanity to invent writing, not as an artistic or spiritual pursuit, but as a practical tool to manage the surplus it generated. The grain that had been domesticated in the hills of the Levant and carried across the Anatolian plateau had now, in the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, given rise to bureaucracy, mathematics, and the permanent record. Barley did not merely feed the first cities. It taught them how to count. By the time King Hammurabi of Babylon ascended the throne around 1792 BCE, the city-states of Mesopotamia had been fighting each other for centuries. He spent the first 3 decades of his reign conquering the rival kingdoms one by one. Larsa fell. Eshnunna fell. Mari fell. By 1754 BCE, Hammurabi ruled a unified empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the upper Euphrates. And he understood something that earlier conquerors had never fully grasped. Military victory was worthless without legal order. An empire held together by force alone would tear itself apart the moment the army weakened. So Hammurabi commissioned a monument that would outlast any single battle. A massive black basalt stele, standing over 2 meters tall, carved with the longest legal text yet produced in human history. At the top of the stele, a carved relief showed Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the god of justice. The king received the laws directly from the divine hand. The message was unmistakable. Disobedience was not merely a crime against the state. It was an offense against the cosmic order. Below the carving, the scribes inscribed 282 laws in densely packed columns of cuneiform. They covered murder, theft, marriage, inheritance, property damage, and medical malpractice. But the single most frequently mentioned commodity in the entire legal code was barley. The grain that had taught the first cities how to count now taught the first empire how to govern. Law 257 addressed the agricultural workforce directly. It stated that if a man hired a field laborer, he should pay him 8 gur of barley per year. A gur was approximately 300 liters, making the annual wage roughly 2,400 liters of grain. That quantity was not arbitrary. It represented enough calories to sustain a laborer and a small family for 12 months, with a modest surplus for trade or storage. The law fixed this wage across the entire empire. A farmer in the northern highlands and a farmer in the southern marshlands received the same barley standard. Wages could not be negotiated downward by a powerful landowner. They could not be inflated upward by a labor shortage. The king's word set the value of human work in grain, and that value was uniform. Law 88 addressed the lending of barley. It stated that if a merchant loaned barley to a borrower, the maximum interest was 1/3 of the principal per year, 33 1/3%. That cap applied specifically to barley loans. A separate law governed silver loans at a lower rate, but barley, being the subsistence staple, carried this higher allowance. The logic was brutal but pragmatic. A farmer who borrowed seed grain at planting time would repay from the harvest surplus. If the harvest was good, the 1/3 interest was manageable. If the harvest failed, the debt rolled forward, and the farmer's obligation compounded. The law acknowledged the reality that grain was not money in the abstract sense. It was a living commodity, subject to rot, to rats, to the unpredictable moods of the Euphrates flood. Lending it carried real risk, and the law priced that risk at exactly 1/3. Law 271 addressed the hiring of draft animals in transport. It stated that the daily hire for an ox, a wagon, and its driver was to be paid in barley. The specific quantity varied depending on the season and the nature of the work, but the medium of payment was fixed. A man who owned oxen and a wagon was a man with capital. He could rent them out, accumulate barley beyond what his own fields could produce, and convert that surplus into land, silver, or political influence. But the law required that his earnings be denominated in the same grain that fed the poorest laborer on his estate. Barley was the great equalizer of the Babylonian economy. Every transaction, from the humblest day labor to the largest commercial loan, could be expressed through it. The stele itself was erected in a public place, most likely the temple precinct of Sippar in central Mesopotamia. Any literate person, or anyone who could find a literate person, could read the laws or have them read aloud. The wage of a field hand was public knowledge. The interest ceiling on a barley loan was public knowledge. The cost of hiring an ox and a wagon was public knowledge. This transparency was not democratic in any modern sense, but it was radically stabilizing. A creditor could not invent a higher interest rate behind closed doors, because the law was carved in stone in the temple courtyard. A landowner could not shortchange his laborers at harvest time, because the annual wage was fixed and visible. The entire economy operated within a framework of grain that everyone understood. Barley functioned not merely as a medium of exchange, but as a standard of value against which all other commodities could be measured. A copper axe was worth so many liters of barley. A slave was worth so many gur of barley. A house in the city, a field in the countryside, a marriage dowry, a fine for assault. All of it could be, and frequently was, assessed in barley. The grain was the unit of account around which the entire legal and economic order revolved. The same stealer that prescribed the death penalty for false accusations of murder also specified the precise barley wage for a hired ox driver. Justice and grain were inseparable. Inscribed on the basalt monument, just below the image of Hammurabi receiving authority from Shamash, were the words that made barley a legal instrument backed by divine sanction. The king declared that he had established truth and justice in the language of the land, and the language of the land spoke in measures of barley. Contracts from the period confirm that these laws were not merely symbolic pronouncements. Tens of thousands of clay tablets recovered from Babylonian sites record loans, wages, and debts denominated in barley exactly as the code prescribed. A tablet from the city of Nippur documents a loan of 10 gur of barley at 33% interest, precisely matching the cap established by Law 88. Another from Larsa records the annual wage of a field laborer at 8 gur, precisely matching Law 257. The empire did not merely proclaim the standards. It enforced them through a network of scribes, judges, and temple officials who kept their own records and cross-referenced them against the public text. Barley had traveled a very long way from the wild stands of Hordeum spontaneum on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. It had become, in the hands of Hammurabi's jurists, something unprecedented in human history. A crop that functioned simultaneously as food, as wages, as currency, and as the legal foundation of an empire. The stele would be discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists excavating at Susa in modern Iran, where it had been carried as war booty by an Elamite king centuries after Hammurabi's death. It now stands in the Louvre Museum in Paris. The barley pictograph that had first appeared on the ration tablets of Uruk was no longer merely a symbol of accounting. It was a symbol of law, of sovereignty, of the idea that a ruler's legitimacy could be measured by the fairness of the grain economy over which he presided. By the time the third dynasty of Ur rose to power around 2112 BCE, the administrative machinery of Mesopotamia had been refining itself for over 1,000 years. The scribes of Ur inherited the cuneiform tradition of Uruk and the legal framework of Hammurabi's Babylon. What they built on that foundation was something far more ambitious. Not merely a system of laws and wages, but a command economy that tracked every grain of barley, from the moment it entered the soil to the moment it entered a worker's mouth. The center of this operation was the temple of Inanna at Nippur. Nippur was not the political capital of the Ur III state. That distinction belonged to the city of Ur itself, near the mouth of the Euphrates. But Nippur was the religious heart of Sumer, the seat of the chief god Enlil, and its temple complexes possessed enormous estates. The Inanna temple alone controlled thousands of hectares of agricultural land across the central floodplain, and every transaction involving that land was documented. Tens of thousands of clay tablets have been recovered from the ruins of Nippur's administrative quarter. The tablets are small, most no larger than a human palm, baked hard by the fires that destroyed the city centuries after the Ur III dynasty collapsed. They record everything. A tablet from the 4th year of King Shulgi's reign lists the area of a barley field measured in iku, the standard unit of land. Another records the quantity of seed grain issued to a team of plowmen at the start of the planting season. A third tracks the harvest yield from that same field months later, noting the total volume threshed and the percentage lost to spoilage. Every field had a number. Every farmer had a name. Every basket of grain had a destination. The logic behind this obsession with documentation was brutally simple. The temple owned the land. The temple supplied the seed, the oxen, and the irrigation water. The farmers who worked the fields were not independent peasants, but laborers in a vast state-managed enterprise. Their output belonged to the temple. And the temple, in turn, was responsible for feeding the population that kept the state running. The monthly barley ration was the foundation of that entire system. A standard male worker received 60 liters of barley per month. A standard female worker received 30 liters. These quantities were not arbitrary. They were calculated precisely to sustain a human being without waste and without starvation. 60 liters per month worked out to roughly 2 liters of barley per day, enough to produce the flatbreads and porridges that formed the caloric backbone of the Sumerian diet. A worker who received his full ration could feed himself. A worker who received less would weaken, sicken, and eventually become unable to perform the physical labor the state demanded. The ration lists from Nippur show meticulous attention to this calculus. Scribes recorded the name of each recipient, the date of disbursement, the quantity measured out from the granary, and the official who authorized the transfer. Witnesses stamped the tablet with their cylinder seals, creating a permanent legal record. If a worker later claimed he had not been paid, the tablet could be retrieved and examined. The grain did not simply flow from temple to worker in a simple exchange. Every step of the process generated its own documentation. The plow teams received their seed grain from the temple granary, recorded on one tablet. The harvest was measured as it came in from the fields, recorded on another. The grain was transported to centralized storage facilities, where it was sorted by quality and type, recorded on a third. The ration disbursements to workers were recorded on a fourth. At any moment, a scribe could trace a specific basket of barley from the field where it grew to the mouth that ate it. This level of control required an enormous bureaucracy. The archives at Nippur alone reference hundreds of scribes, overseers, field captains, granary superintendents, and labor supervisors. Each of these officials received a barley ration of their own, scaled to their rank and function. A senior temple administrator might receive several times the standard worker's allotment, along with additional allowances of oil and wool. His subordinates received less, but still enough to maintain their households and their status. The scribes who kept the records occupied a peculiar position in this hierarchy. They did not plow fields or dig canals. Their work left no calluses on their palms. But their literacy made them indispensable. A tablet from Nippur records the graduation of a class of young scribes from the temple school, each of them now entitled to draw a monthly barley ration from the state stores. The ceremony was a bureaucratic milestone, not a religious one. The boys would be assigned to a senior scribe, given a stylus and a supply of damp clay, and set to work copying the endless records that kept the empire fed. The women who appear in the ration lists occupy a narrower range of roles. The 30-liter female ration was standard, applied to millers, weavers, and temple servants alike. Some records suggest that women with specialized skills could receive more. A head weaver in a temple textile workshop might draw 40 liters per month, and rations could increase during periods of heavy labor demand. But the baseline was fixed. Male workers received 60 liters. Female workers received 30. The difference was not a matter of law, as in Hammurabi's code, but a matter of administrative practice, repeated on tens of thousands of tablets across the Ur III state. The temple granaries that held this grain were monumental structures in their own right. Excavations at Nippur have revealed massive storage complexes with walls of baked brick, designed to keep barley dry and cool in the Mesopotamian heat. The grain was poured into the bins through openings near the roof and extracted through small doorways at the base, where scribes could measure each withdrawal precisely. The largest granaries held thousands upon thousands of liters. A single complex could feed a city, and the cities of the Ur III state were hungry. The workforce sustained by this system was vast by ancient standards. Tens of thousands of men and women across southern Mesopotamia depended on temple and palace rations for their daily survival. Plowmen, weavers, brickmakers, canal diggers, stonecutters, potters, and soldiers all drew their monthly allotments from the same network of granaries and scribal offices. Without the barley ration, none of them could work. Without their work, the temples would crumble, the canals would silt up, and the fields would go fallow. Barley had become more than a food or a currency or a legal standard. It was the physical substance that made organized society possible. Far to the west, another civilization had discovered the power of barley. On the Giza Plateau, the Great Pyramids rose against the desert sky. They were not built by slaves. They were built by a rotating workforce of skilled laborers and conscripted farmers who lived in a purpose-built settlement at the foot of the plateau. The site was called Hayt el Ghurab. In the late 20th century, archaeologist Mark Lehner began excavating the ruins of that workers' town. What he found rewrote the story of how the pyramids were fed. The settlement contained massive industrial bakeries and breweries laid out in neat, walled compounds. Mud brick ovens lined the baking courts in long rows. Ceramic vats for brewing stood in adjacent chambers, their interiors still stained with ancient residue. The operation was not a household kitchen. It was a state-run food factory designed to produce rations on a staggering scale. Every day, the workers received 4 to 5 loaves of bread and 4 to 5 liters of beer. The bread was dense and gritty, baked from emmer wheat and barley flour. The beer was thick and cloudy, brewed from the same 2 grains. Together, the bread and beer delivered the calories a laborer needed to haul stone blocks up muddy ramps in the baking heat. Thousands of men depended on this daily ration. The bakeries ran continuously, grinding grain in saddle querns and mixing dough in deep troughs. The breweries mashed and fermented grain in enormous vats, then decanted the finished beer into storage jars. Without this industrial grain processing system, the pyramids could not have been built. Barley was at its heart. Lehner's team recovered charred barley grains from the bakery floors, their identity confirmed under magnification. Emmer wheat appeared alongside it, but barley was the workhorse. Its hardiness made it reliable in the Nile's flood regime. Barley could tolerate the slightly saline soils near the river's edge where emmer struggled, and its short growing season allowed farmers to harvest before the annual inundation arrived. The grain was stored in granaries built adjacent to the bakeries. Those granaries were themselves marvels of practical engineering. To understand how the Egyptians managed their grain reserves, one surviving document is invaluable. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, now in the British Museum, dates to around 1650 BCE. Its author, a scribe named Ahmose, copied it from an older work in the 12th dynasty. Most of its problems involve fractions and geometry, but several deal directly with barley storage. Problem 41 asks the reader to calculate the volume of a cylindrical granary with a height of 10 cubits and a diameter of 12 cubits. Problem 42 gives an even larger cylinder and demands its volume in car, a unit of dry measure. The answers were critical. A scribe who miscalculated a granary's capacity could not tell the pharaoh how much barley was on hand. He could not plan for a lean year. The papyrus proves that the Egyptian state thought about barley in precise mathematical terms, just as the temple scribes at Nippur had done centuries earlier. Granary volumes were not estimates. They were calculated. The actual storage bins at Hayt el-Ghurab were often rectangular, but cylindrical silos existed elsewhere in the Nile Valley. Their thick mud brick walls kept the grain cool and dry despite the flooding. A single large silo could hold enough barley to feed a work gang for months. The state's command of grain extended far beyond the pyramid builders. Centuries after the Giza complexes were completed, the pharaohs continued to treat barley as a primary instrument of power. At Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes, Ramses III built an enormous mortuary temple in the early 12th century BCE. Its walls were covered with reliefs and inscriptions, recording the pharaoh's conquests and his generosity to the gods. One inscription listed temple offerings in exhaustive detail. It recorded that the temple received 31,400 sacks of barley. The same inscription counted cattle, geese, incense, and gold, but the barley entry dwarfed them all. Much of that grain was redistributed as wages to the priests, scribes, and craftsmen who kept the temple functioning. The pattern was identical to the one that had operated in the workers' town at Giza 13 centuries earlier. Barley entered the granary as tribute or harvest. It left as rations, measured out by scribes with reed brushes and stone pallets. The names of the recipients were logged on rolls of papyrus that have long since turned to dust. But the stone inscriptions survived. The surviving records from Medinet Habu show that the temple's economic power rested squarely on its ability to command barley production across vast estates. These estates stretched from the Delta to Upper Egypt, and their output flowed into the temple's storehouses. Scribes tracked every sack. Overseers monitored the planting and the harvest. The pharaoh's officials knew that without barley, the temples would fall silent and the army would starve. Barley, therefore, did not merely feed the bodies of Egypt, it fed the state. Half a millennium after the scribes at Medinet Habu tallied their barley offerings, the grain story shifted west to the Italian peninsula. The Roman Empire had inherited the Mediterranean world, and with it, an enduring relationship with barley. A Roman naturalist named Pliny the Elder would record that relationship in encyclopedic detail. Between 77 and 79 CE, Pliny compiled the Natural History, a vast survey of the known world across 37 books. He covered geography, botany, medicine, and almost every crop under Roman cultivation. In Book 18, Pliny turned his attention to barley and made a sweeping claim. He declared that barley was the most ancient food of man. Archaeologists would later prove him right at Ohalo II, but Pliny had no need of excavations. He drew on a tradition of agricultural knowledge stretching back to the Greeks and beyond. But Pliny added a detail that still captures the imagination today. He wrote that Roman gladiators were formerly called horderii. The word meant barley eaters. Pliny did not explain the term fully, but its meaning was clear to any Roman reader. Barley defined these fighters. Gladiatorial combat was a brutal institution, and the men who fought in the arena were prized commodities. A gladiator's value to his owner depended on his survival, his strength, and his appearance. Their diet was carefully managed. A Greek physician named Galen, practicing in Rome during the 2nd century CE, left a more clinical account. In his treatise, On the Properties of Foodstuffs, Galen described the gladiators' daily regimen. He noted that they consumed large quantities of barley and beans. The barley was often served as a porridge, or as a dense, heavy bread. The beans, usually broad beans, provided additional protein. Galen observed that this diet built a thick layer of both muscle and subcutaneous fat. The fat was not a sign of poor conditioning. It served a grim, practical purpose in the arena. A layer of fat protected the fighter's nerves and blood vessels from surface cuts. A wounded gladiator could continue to fight even after a slash that would disable a leaner man. The barley and bean diet produced exactly the physique that a lanista wanted. Galen's description matched Pliny's brief label. The horderii earned their name. For nearly 2,000 years, these written accounts were the only evidence for the gladiator diet. Then, in the late 20th century, archaeologists began excavating a gladiator cemetery at Ephesus, on the coast of modern Turkey. The cemetery lay near the ancient stadium where gladiators fought before crowds of thousands. Between 1993 and 2007, researchers uncovered the remains of over 60 individuals. Their bones told a story of violent death, with healed fractures and fatal wounds etched into the skeletons. But the bones also preserved a chemical record of what these men ate. Scientists analyzed the strontium and calcium ratios locked in the mineral matrix of the bones. Strontium and calcium enter the body through food and water. As plants grow, they absorb strontium from the soil more readily than animal tissues do. A diet heavy in plants leaves a distinct, elevated strontium to calcium signature in human bone. The gladiators of Ephesus showed exactly that signature. Their strontium levels were high, consistent with a predominantly vegetarian diet. The chemical data aligned perfectly with the ancient texts. These men had indeed been barley eaters. The isotope analysis confirmed that the grain dominated their meals. Barley was cheap, abundant, and calorie-dense. It fueled men whose job required enormous energy expenditure during training and combat. The same grain that had fed pyramid builders and Mesopotamian laborers now sustained the fighters of the Roman arena. Pliny the Elder also recorded other uses for barley that extended far beyond the gladiator barracks. He described how Roman physicians prepared medical plasters from barley flour. The flour was mixed with water or wine and sometimes combined with resin or honey. The resulting paste was spread on linen and applied to wounds, swellings, and inflamed joints. Pliny claimed that these barley plasters drew out sickness and soothed pain. The practice was widespread in the Roman world and persisted in folk medicine for centuries. He further detailed the gristing of barley for bread. Roman bakers produced barley loaves that were darker, denser, and coarser than the prized wheat bread of the wealthy. Barley bread was the food of soldiers, slaves, and the urban poor. It was also the food of gladiators, who consumed it in enormous quantities alongside their porridge and beans. The Roman state knew what every empire before it had learned. A reliable supply of barley meant a fed army, a docile populace, and fighters ready for the arena. The grain's journey through human history had now touched nearly every corner of the ancient world. From the marshes of the Yangtze to the paddies of the Levant and the granaries of Egypt, barley had built civilization. In Rome, it built men who would die for the entertainment of the crowd. In the winter of 1085, William the Conqueror ordered a survey of his English kingdom. Commissioners rode out to every shire, every hundred, every manor. They recorded who owned the land, what it was worth, and what it produced. The result was the Doomsday Book, completed in 1086. Its name came from the Old English word for judgment. No appeal was possible against its recorded facts. The book listed assets in exhaustive detail. Plow teams, meadows, woodlands, mills, fisheries, and livestock all appeared in its pages. But one crop appeared more often than any other: barley. Manor after manor recorded renders in ordium, the Latin word for barley. The entries were precise and unflinching. In Norfolk, a manor owed the king 20 measures of barley annually. In Suffolk, another rendered 15 measures for the king's horses. In Yorkshire, abbeys collected barley as tithes from their tenant farmers. The grain was measured in modi, in seams, in quarters. It was the fuel of the medieval economy. Barley fed the plow oxen that turned the heavy clay soils of northern Europe. It fed the war horses that carried armored knights into battle. It fed the peasant families who worked the land from dawn to dusk. Barley bread was the staple food of the English countryside. Wheat bread was a luxury for the Lord's table. Barley porridge filled the bellies of children before they walked to the fields. Barley malt went into the ale that every household brewed. Ale was not a luxury in medieval England. It was a necessity. Water was often unsafe to drink. Weak, cloudy, low-alcohol ale provided hydration and calories in a single cup. Men, women, and children drank it daily. The Doomsday Book recorded none of this human detail. It was a cold ledger of assets and obligations. But buried in its columns of numbers was the plain truth. Barley was the backbone of Norman England. It remained so for the next 4 centuries. Then, in the autumn of 1493, barley crossed an ocean. Christopher Columbus had returned from his first voyage to reports of empty islands and vast potential. The Spanish crown authorized a second expedition immediately. This was no scouting mission. 17 ships assembled at Cadiz. They carried 1,200 men, horses, pigs, sheep, and seeds. Among those seeds was barley. A Spanish historian named Bartolomé de las Casas recorded the details. He wrote that Columbus brought seeds of wheat, chickpeas, melons, and many other European crops. Barley was among the first to be planted. The fleet made landfall on the island of Hispaniola in November of 1493. The sailors unloaded their cargo onto a shore they barely understood. They cleared patches of forest and dug rough fields in the alien soil. They scattered barley seed and waited. The grain had never grown west of the Atlantic before. It had no relationship with this soil, this rainfall, this sun. It grew anyway. The planting was part of a deliberate strategy. Columbus intended his colony to be self-sufficient. European crops would reshape the landscape to resemble the world the colonists had left behind. Barley adapted faster than most. Its short growing season and tolerance for poor soil served it well in the Caribbean heat. Within a few harvests, barley was feeding Spanish settlements across Hispaniola. From there, it spread with the conquistadors. Hernán Cortés carried it into Mexico. Francisco Pizarro brought it to Peru. The grain that had once grown wild in the marshes of the Fertile Crescent was now rooted in the volcanic soil of the Andes and the high plains of New Spain. Barley had become a global crop. 3 decades later, on the other side of the Atlantic, a German duke made a decision that would define barley's future for the next 500 years. Duke Wilhelm IV of Bavaria ruled a prosperous territory in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. His capital at Munich was surrounded by breweries. Brewing was big business, and it was also a regulatory nightmare. Brewers cut their malt with cheap fillers. Wheat, rye, oats, even beans and tree bark found their way into the mash. Some additives were merely fraudulent. Others were actively poisonous. In 1516, Wilhelm decided to clean house. He summoned his council and drafted a law that would become legend, the Reinheitsgebot, the Bavarian purity law. It was a short document, but its core commandment was absolute. Beer could be brewed from only 3 ingredients: barley, hops, water. That was it. The law made no mention of yeast, which brewers did not yet understand, but it banned everything else. No wheat, no rye, no spices, herbs, or chemical additives of any kind. The penalty for violation was confiscation of the offending barrels without mercy. Wilhelm's motivation was not romantic. He wanted to protect the supply of wheat and rye for the baking of bread. Barley was relegated to brewing by legal design. The unintended consequence was the creation of a pure, stable, consistent product. Barley malt gave Bavarian beer its characteristic color, body, and fermentable sugars. The hops provided bitterness and antimicrobial preservation. The water carried the minerals of Bavarian springs and aquifers. The Reinheitsgebot became the foundation of German brewing culture. It spread across the German states over the following centuries. When Bavaria joined the German Empire in 1871, the law was a condition of unification. It remained in force, in modified form, until the late 20th century. Some German breweries obey it voluntarily to this day. The law accomplished something no ancient governor or temple scribe had ever achieved. It made barley the legal soul of beer. Not the preferred grain, not the most common grain, the only grain. The same barley that had been pulled from a swamp in the Jordan Valley 23,000 years earlier. The same barley that had fed the pyramid builders, the gladiators of Rome, and the peasants of England. It was now locked into the identity of the most popular fermented beverage on Earth. The grain's biological endurance had always been its strength. Its chemical makeup, the specific enzymes and starches that made it ideal for malting and fermentation, had been invisible to every farmer who ever planted a field. Wilhelm IV did not know why barley made the best beer. He only knew that it did, and he wrote that knowledge into law. The seeds Columbus scattered on Hispaniola continued their expansion across the Americas. By the 18th century, barley fields stretched from Quebec to Chile.